Hello, my name is Jim Harris. I would like to present this lecture entitled No Vulnerable Intellectuals. Allow me to give a bit of a personal introduction. I was born and raised in the UK up to age 24. As a young man, I was very interested in farming. Any spare moment, I liked to be out on the farm on which my father was working. Particularly interested in working with sheep, but just outside, doing important things, producing food. That took me to agricultural college, and while at agricultural college, God challenged me to say, are you just going to use your life and your skills to add to food mountains in Europe? Or are you available to serve where people are hungry? That challenge gradually worked at my heart until in 1987, while doing teacher training, I committed myself before God to take up that challenge. Now for me, it was either life or not at all, which seems to be a peculiar orientation these days, where a lot of people like to do a short-term mission to begin with, but that didn't make sense to me, because I thought, well, if God wants me to do mission, and so what if I have a bad first year? Anyway, I'm glad to say that by 1988 I managed to find an opening in Zambia to teach at a secondary school agricultural science. Being in Zambia was an enormous eye-opener. In many ways I did a 180-degree turn. I went to Zambia thinking or knowing that my technological knowledge was going to be of the most valuable to the indigenous people. By the time 3 years were up, I was severely doubting my technical knowledge. As someone not trained in social science or anything like that, many of the things I met in Zambia just came out of the blue. I didn't know that such a world could exist. Back in the UK, I did some studies in rural development and then emissions. And that, with the prior 3 years in Zambia, resulted in my conviction that I should be back in Africa, I should be teaching the Bible, I should be using local languages, and I should be using local resources. That practice we now know as vulnerable mission. Vulnerable mission being ministry carried out, especially by a Western person in Africa or the majority world, using indigenous languages, using indigenous resources. God opened the door in 1993 for me to go to Kenya. I started living in a village in western Kenya. I still live within 2 or 3 miles of the same home I was in then, and continue relating to the same church, building relationships with the same set of people in that vicinity to date. Now my ministry, I often say, is in 4 areas. 1, I look after orphan children at home. 2, I do Bible teaching to a variety of churches in the vicinity. Thirdly, I'm engaged in a lot of writing, scholarship, study. And fourthly, I do some hospital chaplaincy work here with the Coptic Hospital in Western Kenya. The basic question I want to ask is, how should we respond to people who are different from us? I want to look at 2 models. One, the way we are trained to respond in the Western world. My particular focus is on UK and particularly the US, as the US, what happens in the US kind of becomes global. And secondly, I want to give an alternative model. To many people, I think that which tells us how to respond to people who are different in the Western world comes under the category of anti-racism. In other words, we shouldn't be racist. What is it to not be racist? Now obviously this is a large and complex field, but I suggest it's very hard in the light of the general advocacy for not treating people different to do other than try to be colorblind. So although I know there's discussion on this, the way racism, anti-racism is interpreted is treat other people as if they are the same as you. Within the West, when we meet people from different parts of the world, we engage with them in English. Within the West, when people come from other parts of the world to the West, they are received by a system largely that looks after them, particularly in terms of financial provision. So the Western countries like to receive foreign people and make sure they are sufficiently provided for. I know there's talk, for example, in the US now that blacks in the US, for example, should be given reparations because of the way they were being treated 300 years ago. In other words, intercultural issues are dealt with using finance. Now, the alternative that I want to propose is what we're calling vulnerable mission. And that is to say that some missionaries, in other words, some Christians in relating to those who are different from us, should relate to them using their own languages, not using Western or European languages, and should relate to them by drawing on the resources of the people who they are relating to. One of the problems I suggest with the situation we face today is that the anti-racism situation, particularly in the USA, tends to set the parameters for what happens in terms of intercultural relations in other parts of the world. The powerful USA, with its media, its movies, its influence, particularly through English language affecting Anglophone Africa, tells the rest of the world what is and what should be in terms of intercultural relations. When someone comes to Africa from the West, that's what they're familiar with, that's what they know, that's what they not only value, that's what they know must be. Now, in practice, the way that works out, in my own experience, is when we have new missionaries come to work with us in East Africa from the Western world, they tend to come with a determination that I'm going to treat these African people as if they're the same as us. I'm not going to treat them differently. In other words, I'm not going to be racially biased. That determination is strong, and unfortunately that determination, coming from a kind of enculturation they've acquired from being back at home in their Western country, tends to make people blind and deaf to what's actually going on culturally around them when they reach Africa. Closely related to that situation is, let's call it, the problem of the widespread use of a global language. Many African countries, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, use English as their official language. Official functions within these countries, education, formal sectors, government, occur not using their own language, but using English. This situation we find ourselves in now, I just point out, was not preferred by the British colonialists in bygone years. Pre-World War II, the orientation by the British colonial power was that English should be perhaps for a few African people, Indian people, to help them to communicate with the West, but these countries need to develop, run, and function using their own languages. What happens when English is the official language in African states while being dominated by native English speakers, particularly the UK, particularly the US, is that it becomes extraordinarily difficult let's say even it becomes impossible for people in these African states not to overtly take on board what's happening within those Western countries and those Western cultures. It makes them, in a sense, victim to what's going on in other parts of the world. We can look at this concern in a number of ways. Western countries, the UK and the US, consider themselves to be secular. That secular nature of our communities arises as a result of a long history. That long history includes roots in Greek philosophy, centuries of powerful influence of the gospel on our forefathers, setting the parameters of society. We've inherited all that, and we use English today in education, in government, in business, to build on that foundation that we've acquired from our ancestors in order to function effectively in the modern world. Now, what if that same discourse, the same language uses, the same wisdom or lack of wisdom now have to be used by African people who do not share all that history? There's a massive misfit. The correct discourse does not tally with the situation in the country or the way that people are. That goes across the board. Let's just take an example of scholarship. If you read scholarship, formal scholarship, coming, say, from East Africa or coming from South Africa, coming from Nigeria, you'll find, in my experience, African scholars know they have to write as if they're Americans, as if they're Brits. They write about their people, them. They have to write on the understanding, on the basis of a presupposition, that they too have passed through the history that we in the West have passed, which is a great injustice to oblige people not to look at issues as their own people see them, as they themselves see them, but in formal circles, in education and in research, for example, to be obliged to always consider issues as Westerners perceive them to be. I've been privileged to have been using indigenous African languages since 1988. I must admit, in the early days, I tended to treat the African languages as equivalents to English. Kind of an inevitable way of functioning, really, thinking in English, using in African languages. More recently, I've been struck by the massive differences in perception going on linguistically. The effects of those differences in perception we see in people's lifestyles, how they live, what they do, why they do it. And the same one perceives in due course are inherent in the language. Let me just give some examples of things that are present in Western language uses, but seem to me clearly to be absent in African language uses. One is related to the term supernatural. Now, many of my African colleagues will use the term supernatural in their English language discourse. That's because supernatural is a term that is kind of mainstream in English. But that of itself doesn't mean that my African colleagues get what we mean by supernatural. In other words, that there is a natural area of action, which is like a clock that's been wound up, and then there's something supernatural, which is God kind of occasionally coming and intervening. As a related term, efficiency. In the Western worldview, we tend to see processes as happening more or less efficiently on an input-output basis. And that efficiency tends to be related to economic efficiency. So if you're going to perform a certain function, say in a business, maybe baking bread, you try and maximize the output of bread per given amount of effort or time. African people, I'm sure, can use the term efficiency. But I'm not so sure that many of them will grasp at depth what that term implies. Another example, love. Love obviously is a very wide term and can be used in different ways, but I want to suggest that there's a perception of love in the Western world as giving yourself sacrificially for an other, and that other may not be related to you. Now, I think that conception of love is really straight out of the Bible, straight out of Christianity, straight out of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And for that reason, how can we expect it to be present amongst African people who haven't had generations-long exposure to the gospel? Also works the other way around. We have something in the Luo language in Kenya called chira. Now, chira is something like the misfortune or the illness that strikes someone who contravenes ancestral taboo. Tends to result in a wasting away, just like acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So I think it's clear that many Luo people in Kenya, their understanding of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, or HIV, is inseparable to their comprehension that that kind of illness and wasting away arises from a breaking of ancestral taboo. So there's a massive amount of content there in the Luo way of looking at the world that is largely absent in English. Another example to illustrate what's indigenous to Africa, let's call it a pecking order. There's a kind of an assumed hierarchy. People one can relate to in a certain way. So an older child will send a younger child, a mother will send an older child or a younger child, and a father can send the mother the older child or the younger child. The gender related to the age and the familial relationships determine what one can say to someone and what one can't say or shouldn't say. Again, an enormous, very consequential content in family relationships that is much more ambiguous in the Western world. Finally, looking at the issue of envy. I think envy is a universal problem, but the way envy is considered, dressed up, practiced or prohibited or dealt with is vastly different. Envy, I take as being the power underlying juok. Juok amongst the Luo people is witchcraft, whereas envy in the West is not considered related to witchcraft. So even though juok and witchcraft translate each other largely, the content of juok in Kenya, which is very much to do with envy, is not in witchcraft in the West, it's somewhere else. I note that a lot of the efforts oriented to interracial equality in the Northern Hemisphere, let's say in the US and UK particularly, tend to work on the basis that there should be some kind of material equality. As a result of that philosophy, native Western people, we can call them that, try to encourage immigrants to have a higher income. Mechanisms are put in place like positive discrimination to try and lower income gaps and encourage foreign people, people of other ethnicities, Africans, a case in point, to gradually move up to Western levels of income. Now, I mean, that system is kind of admirable in some ways. One effect of it is, of course, that if it's the Westerners doing that for the African people, then the initiative in bringing the equality remains with the Westerners. This is supported by the anti-racist kind of ideology that there should not be racial differences in terms of well-being, in terms of earnings, in terms of prestige and so forth. Now, this interracial gap being closed, or the effort at closing the interracial gap coming from, let's say, the dominant European people, yet makes anti-racism into a kind of white supremacy. Now, one wonders, okay, within the US, that gap is much studied and people are trying to reduce the gap. But what about the rest of the continent of Africa? I mean, is that kind of forgotten because they're not American citizens, they don't count? Well, to some extent, yes, but yet America's media and communication being dominant around the world is kind of telling the world, well, this is the way life should be done. It should be a matter of boosting people's incomes. Yet that reasoning that people's incomes should be boosted comes from people of white European origin. So fulfillment of the North American kind of anti-racist agenda, it seems to me, is heading towards, or is perpetuating, white domination in Africa. Now, that white domination doesn't have to be the white person on the ground. The white person may not be visible at all, but yet their thinking, or the white thinking, underlies the agenda that they're projecting. Now, I think this is a dangerous way to go forward, and the Corona crisis kind of illustrated something of that danger, where what continued to happen during the coronavirus crisis is that the Western thinking wasn't even translated into Africa. It was just brought wholesale into Africa, and the African people told, get on with applying this in your community. And the application, I think, left a lot wanting. The identity of being European goes with me, it seems, wherever I travel in Africa. Now, ironically, those less familiar with the African context may not even be aware of the identity that they are carrying, an identity of generosity, a particular kind of generosity, an identity of being the owners of a superior language, which orients indigenous people to wanting to benefit from that generosity and often wanting to acquire that language. Now, that orientation, which often proves very fruitful, in other words, those people who manage to, say, befriend and develop a relationship with a Westerner in the African continent often are the people who become successful in their own community. This, of course, also means that the Western person who is so engaged, because of how desirable they are, and because they're addressed as a means of trying to give people prosperity, it's very hard for that person to get on the inside of what's happening in the community. This means that the internal workings of the community, which of course function with indigenous languages, tend to remain foreign and unknown to the outside person, to the outside missionary. Now, the only way, it seems to me, of trying to step out of that identity, and it can't happen quickly in my own experience, and to begin to relate to people in a way that gives you ears to listen to what they're actually saying and even eyes to observe what they're actually doing and why they're doing it, is the principles of vulnerable mission I've mentioned, being that some Westerners should not use outside languages but should only use indigenous languages engagement with African people. And that indigenous language needs to be really from top to bottom of what they're doing. Many outside-led projects, you have something translated for those ignorant African people who don't know English. But it's very clear that the whole thing, the hierarchy, the real benefits are going to be gained by those who do know English. And secondly, resources. Can you join me in this? Will you help me? Will you travel with me? I mean, for many Africans, for a white person to give that invitation, yes, of course, because that gives an opportunity to develop relationship further. And there's a strong likelihood that that relationship will result in some kind of funding or material benefit, we could say. So in order to discern what people's actual interest in you is, you need to not have resources to hand out. And this is, in my own experience, quite sobering, because, I mean, when I first came to Kenya, I had a relatively high opinion of myself, and that shouldn't be surprising, because a foreigner coming to Kenya with my skin complexion tends to get very special treatment as people anticipate benefits that will flow. Now, if those benefits consistently don't flow, and I'm talking about 28 years, then eventually people will get the idea that actually they can say no. And to be able to be told no is, I think, really critical if one wants to know, to understand, to comprehend what the truth is in Africa and what's actually, let's say, going on. By way of conclusion, I'd like to say 4 things. 1, hearing African people engaging in English when one knows how they engage in their own languages is very strange. In other words, what is it? It's neither native English, because they don't have that historical cultural background. Neither is it communication as they do it amongst themselves, because they're having to use a language they're not familiar with, and they're having to imitate a style that isn't their own. This does raise big questions, I think. Can non-Western societies, I'm thinking about African societies, become Western? How long will intellectual dependency continue? The apparent developments maybe are more apparent than real. Are we talking about an ongoing intellectual dependency? Underlying those questions is my conviction that the gap filler is not secularism. Secular thinking doesn't have the foundation, it doesn't have the breadth, it doesn't have the content that can close a gap between what's happening in Africa and how African people are thinking and how they're communicating, and what's happening in the West today. Secularism is like a solidified theology, no longer flexible, no longer fluid. It's God's word, it's faith in Christ that changes people profoundly, deeply, and can transform societies. So I'm not advocating for revolution. Rather, what I'm advocating for is that we need some, more than now, missionaries to work interculturally, vulnerably, using indigenous languages and indigenous resources, not foreign languages and foreign resources, in key ministry. More should be doing this.